Billionaire humiliated a single mother until she spoke a word that made the room silent. In a private hospital hallway, a powerful billionaire publicly shames a quiet single mother, accusing her of not belonging there. Doctors stop. Nurses stare. Everyone watches as he tears her down, certain he's untouchable. Then she looks him in the eye and says just one sentence. And the room goes completely silent. Because the truth she carries isn't about money, or power, or status. It's about a secret from years ago, one he never bothered to ask about. A life-saving gift, an anonymous sacrifice, and a child standing right beside her. Now guilt, fear, and pride collide in a place where lives hang in the balance. When the man who had everything discovers who really saved him, will he choose humility or lose the chance at redemption forever? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. And if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty sidewalks as Ember Carter and her 10-year-old son Arlo made their way through the sleeping city. At 4:30 in the morning, their footsteps echoed in the quiet, accompanied only by the occasional whoosh of a passing car or the distant rumble of delivery trucks. Ember pulled her worn navy jacket closer, glancing down at Arlo, who walked beside her with his characteristic unhurried grace. His brown eyes were alert despite the early hour, taking in everything around them with quiet interest. She smiled softly, grateful for his easy acceptance of their unusual schedule. "Look, Mom," Arlo whispered, pointing to a cardinal perched on a nearby fence. "He's awake early, too." "Just like us," Ember replied, her voice gentle. Early birds catching the morning quiet. As they walked, Ember's prayers flowed silently, as natural as breathing. "Lord, thank you for this new day. Thank you for Arlo's healthy spirit. Guide our steps." Her prayers had become more frequent over the years, especially in hospitals. Those sterile corridors had witnessed so many chapters of their story, more than she'd ever expected when she first started working as a night custodian at St. Michael's private hospital. The sky was beginning to lighten, painting the clouds in soft shades of pink and lavender. Ember checked her watch. They were right on schedule. The familiar bulk of St. Michael's came into view, its modern glass facade reflecting the approaching dawn. The building held so many memories, both painful and precious. It was where Arlo had been born, where she'd found work when others turned her away, where she'd learned that dignity wasn't about what you did, but how you did it. "Mom?" Arlo's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Can I help you clean the children's ward windows again tonight? I promise to be careful with the spray bottle." Ember smiled, touched by his eagerness to help. "We'll see, sweetheart. First, let's get you settled in the break room with your books." They entered through the staff entrance, the familiar antiseptic smell greeting them. The night shift workers nodded in recognition as they passed, nurses ending their shifts, other custodial staff beginning theirs. Over the years, they'd become something like family, sharing midnight snacks and quiet conversations in empty corridors. Arlo followed her to the small break room, where he'd spend the first few hours before the hospital's daycare opened. He pulled out his backpack, carefully arranging his school books and the drawing pad he never went without. Ember watched him, her heart full. Despite their circumstances, he'd never complained about spending his early mornings in a hospital break room. "I brought extra graham crackers today," he said, pulling out a package, "in case Maria from the cafeteria wants to share breakfast again." "That's thoughtful of you," Ember replied, hanging up her jacket. She checked her cleaning cart, making sure all supplies were in order. The morning routine was familiar, comfortable even, but something felt different today. Maybe it was the way the sunrise painted the hallways in unusual colors, or perhaps it was just her imagination. The hospital was shifting from night to day, the quiet halls gradually filling with more activity. Ember had just finished mopping the second-floor corridor when her phone vibrated in her pocket. The number displayed made her pause. It was from the administrator's office. "Mrs. Carter?" The crisp voice of Dr. Harrison's secretary came through. "The administrator would like to see you in his office later today, at 2 o'clock, if possible." Ember's hand tightened on her mop handle. In 6 years of working at St. Michael's, she'd never been called to the administrator's office. "Yes, I'll be there," she responded, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden flutter of anxiety in her stomach. As she hung up, Ember looked out the window at the now bright morning sky. The cardinal from earlier flew past, a flash of red against the blue. She closed her eyes briefly, another prayer rising from her heart. "Lord, whatever comes, give me strength to face it with grace." The hospital corridors stretched before her, familiar yet suddenly uncertain. She pushed her cart forward, ready to face whatever the day might bring, one clean floor at a time. Checking her watch again, Ember noted she had several hours before the meeting. She returned to her routine, finding comfort in the rhythm of work, in the quiet satisfaction of making things clean and orderly. As she moved through the hospital's corridors, she thought about how these halls had become more than just a workplace. They were the backdrop to Arlo's childhood, the place where they'd found their footing after difficult times. The morning light streamed through the windows she'd cleaned countless times, catching the dust motes in golden beams. In the children's ward, she could hear the young patients starting to wake, their voices mixing with the general bustle of hospital life. This was her world, these clean corridors and quiet moments, the gentle nods of acknowledgement from doctors and nurses who'd come to respect her steady presence. Ember paused in her work to check on Arlo during her break. She found him absorbed in his reading, exactly where she'd left him, though now he was sharing his graham crackers with Maria, the elderly cafeteria worker who'd taken a shine to him years ago. The sight warmed her heart. Her son's ability to form genuine connections with others never ceased to amaze her. "Everything okay, Mom?" Arlo asked, looking up from his book with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see right through her. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," she assured him, smoothing his hair. "Just a busy morning ahead." As she resumed her duties, Ember reflected on how hospitals had indeed shaped their lives in unexpected ways. From the day she'd discovered she was pregnant, through Arlo's birth, and now their daily life here, these sterile halls held their history. She'd learned to find peace in the routine of cleaning, in the quiet dignity of making things better, even if just by making them cleaner. The morning continued its steady march toward afternoon, and with each passing hour, Ember felt the weight of the upcoming meeting more keenly. Yet she maintained her composure, focused on her tasks, and held on to her faith. Whatever was coming, she would face it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through everything else. The morning light filtered through the cafeteria windows as Ember sat with Arlo, watching him methodically arrange his remaining graham crackers on a napkin. Her shift had ended, but the unusual meeting with the administrator loomed ahead. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual breakfast crowd, nurses ending their night shifts, day staff arriving, and visitors seeking early morning coffee. "Would you like the last one, Mum?" Arlo offered, holding out a graham cracker with the same gentle thoughtfulness he showed in everything. Before Ember could answer, an urgent commotion at the cafeteria entrance drew their attention. 2 nurses rushed in, speaking in hushed but excited tones as they grabbed coffee. "I can't believe he's here," the first nurse whispered, though her voice carried in the morning quiet. "Charles Whitmore himself, right in our hospital." "Complications from the transplant, I heard?" The second nurse replied, glancing around. "They cleared the entire executive wing for him." Ember's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water bottle. The name struck her like a physical blow, though she kept her face carefully composed. Arlo, ever observant, noticed the slight change in his mother's demeanor. "Mom, are you cold?" he asked, concern evident in his young voice. She managed a small smile. "No, sweetheart, I'm fine." But memories she'd carefully locked away for years began stirring, like autumn leaves disturbed by an unexpected wind. More hospital staff filtered into the cafeteria, each carrying fragments of the same story. Charles Whitmore, the billionaire tech mogul, had been rushed in during the early hours. His transplant from years ago, the one that had saved his life and built his empire, was showing signs of rejection. "They say he's furious," a medical resident whispered to his colleagues at the next table, "demanding to see every specialist in the state." Ember listened while pretending not to, her breakfast untouched before her. The past she'd kept carefully buried was threatening to surface. She watched as Arlo pulled out his book, seemingly oblivious to the growing excitement around them, though she knew he absorbed far more than he let on. "I think we should move upstairs," Ember said softly, gathering their things. Something deep within her, the same quiet voice that had guided her through her hardest decisions, told her she needed to be near the executive wing. They took the less-traveled service corridors, Ember's familiarity with the hospital's layout allowing them to avoid the growing commotion. The executive wing occupied the entire east side of the fourth floor, its thick carpet and wood-paneled walls a stark contrast to the utilitarian halls below. Finding a small waiting area just outside the restricted section, Ember and Arlo settled into the plush chairs. Sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, warming the space and casting long shadows across the expensive furnishings. "Can we pray?" Ember asked, though it was more statement than question. Arlo nodded, taking her hand naturally. This was their way, finding peace in prayer when the world felt uncertain. They sat quietly, heads bowed, as Ember offered silent words of grace and guidance. She prayed for strength, for wisdom, and, after a moment's hesitation, for Charles Whitmore. The same prayers she'd been offering for years, though he'd never known it. The elegant hallway grew increasingly busy as medical staff hurried past, their shoes silent on the thick carpeting. Security personnel appeared at regular intervals, their earpieces and dark suits incongruous in the hospital setting. Ember kept her eyes closed, continuing her prayer even as she heard the elevator doors slide open. The sudden hush that fell over the hallway told her all she needed to know, but still she didn't move. "This is completely unacceptable!" A man's voice cut through the silence, sharp with privilege and anger. "I don't care what your protocols are. I demand to see the transplant records immediately." Ember opened her eyes, finally allowing herself to look. Charles Whitmore stood near the elevator, his expensive suit failing to hide the slight tremor in his hands, his face flushed with both fever and fury. He looked older than the magazine photos she'd seen, but his bearing radiated the same arrogance that had marked every story. She'd read about him. Hospital administrators hovered anxiously around him, trying to calm his anger while maintaining professional composure. But Whitmore dismissed their attempts with sharp gestures and sharper words, his voice rising with each statement. "Sir, please understand," one administrator began. "Some of these records are quite old, and our systems have changed several times since—" "I don't want excuses!" Whitmore snapped, running a hand through his silver hair in frustration. "I built my fortune on information systems. Don't tell me you can't find one simple file." Ember sat perfectly still, her hand still clasped in Arlo's, as the scene unfolded before them. Whitmore hadn't noticed them yet, focused entirely on his demands and his anger. But she could see the fear behind his rage, the terror of a man facing his mortality for the second time. Arlo squeezed her hand gently, and she looked down to find him watching the scene with those wise, quiet eyes that sometimes made her heart ache. He seemed to understand, somehow, that they were witnessing something important, though he couldn't know why. The noise and tension in the hallway continued to build as more medical staff arrived, each trying to address Whitmore's concerns while maintaining protocol. Through it all, Ember remained seated, her prayer unfinished, knowing that the moment she had both dreaded and perhaps unconsciously prepared for had finally arrived. Charles Whitmore's attention snapped toward the waiting area, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Ember and Arlo. The elegant corridor fell silent as his expression darkened further, jaw clenching with fresh irritation. "What is this?" he demanded, gesturing sharply at them. "This is a restricted area. Who let these people up here?" Ember remained seated, her spine straight but her eyes lowered respectfully. She could feel the weight of stares from the gathered hospital staff, their discomfort almost tangible in the thick silence. "I asked a question," Charles continued, his voice rising. "Does anyone monitor access to this floor anymore, or do we just let the cleaning staff loiter wherever they please?" A young administrator stepped forward, clipboard clutched to her chest. "Sir, I'm sure there's an explanation." "The explanation," Charles cut in, "is that security protocols have completely broken down. I'm paying premium rates for this wing, and I find random employees camping out in the hallways?" His gaze raked over Ember's custodial uniform with undisguised disdain. Ember felt Arlo's hand tighten in hers. She squeezed back gently, silently willing him to stay calm. Around them, medical staff shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes, others watching the scene unfold with poorly concealed concern. "Maybe you don't understand English?" Charles said, speaking louder and slower, as if Ember might not comprehend him. "This area is restricted. Private, not for custodial staff. Do you need me to find someone to translate?" The casual racism stung, but Ember kept her expression neutral. She'd faced similar assumptions before, though rarely so publicly. The corridor had grown impossibly quiet now, with even the usual background sounds of the hospital seeming muted. "Security!" Charles barked, turning to one of the suited men nearby. "I want them removed immediately, and I want to know how they got up here in the first place." A security guard started forward reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Ember could see the sympathy in his eyes. They'd exchanged greetings many times during her night shifts. "Sir," the guard began, "I know Mrs. Carter. She's been with the hospital for— I don't care if she's been here since the building was constructed," Charles snapped. "This is a restricted area, and I want her removed. Now." The tension in the hallway had become almost unbearable. Nurses stood frozen with their charts, doctors paused mid-stride, all watching the scene unfold with a mixture of dismay and powerlessness. Ember could feel their silent support, but she knew none of them could risk their careers by challenging someone of Charles Whitmore's influence. As the security guard took another reluctant step forward, Ember finally lifted her head. Her movements were unhurried, dignified, as she rose to her feet. Arlo stood with her, his small hand still firmly in hers. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the hushed corridor. The use of his name made him blink, momentarily thrown off his tirade. "How dare you?" he started, but Ember continued speaking, her tone remaining calm and measured. "Your life depends on my son." The words hung in the air like suspended crystal, sharp and clear and impossible to ignore. Charles stared at her, his mouth still open around his interrupted threat. In the stunning silence that followed, a nurse's clipboard slipped from nerveless fingers, hitting the carpeted floor with a muted thud. Charles Whitmore stood frozen, his face a study in conflicting emotions as he processed her words. Around them, the hospital staff had become living statues, barely seeming to breathe as they watched the scene unfold. Ember met his gaze steadily now, years of carefully maintained dignity evident in her posture. Arlo pressed against her side, quiet but unafraid, as the weight of truth settled over the executive corridor like a heavy blanket. The silence stretched, profound and unbreakable, as Charles Whitmore stared at Ember Carter in utter disbelief. The oppressive silence shattered as Charles let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. It echoed harshly against the corridor's walls, making several staff members flinch. "My life depends on your son?" He shook his head, lips curling into a dismissive sneer. "That's quite the creative attempt at manipulation. What exactly are you hoping to gain here? Money? Recognition?" Ember remained still, her expression unchanging as Charles continued his tirade. "Security," he barked again. "I want these people removed immediately, and I want harassment charges filed. This kind of emotional manipulation is completely unacceptable." "Mr. Whitmore." A clear, authoritative voice cut through the tension. Dr. Helen Ross strode forward, her white coat flowing behind her as she moved with practiced authority. "A moment, please." Charles turned to her, irritation evident in every line of his face. "Dr. Ross, I don't have time for—" "You'll want to make time for this," Dr. Ross interrupted firmly. She held a tablet in her hands, her fingers moving swiftly across its surface. 8 years ago, you received a life-saving organ transplant in this hospital. The donor was pediatric, anonymous by request. Charles's face paled slightly, but he maintained his defensive posture. "That information is supposed to be confidential." "It is," Dr. Ross agreed, her tone professional but gentle. "And it has remained so, despite the donor's mother having every right to come forward. She specifically requested lifelong anonymity and declined any form of compensation." The gathered staff exchanged glances, some beginning to understand the weight of what was unfolding before them. Charles's eyes darted between Dr. Ross and Ember, his certainty visibly wavering. "You can't possibly be suggesting—" He trailed off, looking at Arlo with new eyes. "I never wanted recognition." Ember spoke softly, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "That wasn't why we made our choice." Charles took an unsteady step backward, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the wall. The realization seemed to hit him physically, but even as understanding dawned in his eyes, his pride refused to bend. "This is ridiculous!" he snapped, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. "You expect me to believe that you just happened to be here today? That you've worked in this hospital all these years without ever trying to leverage this information?" "Yes," Ember replied simply. "Because that's exactly what happened." Dr. Ross stepped closer to Charles, her presence both professional and compassionate. "I can verify everything, Mr. Whitmore. I was the attending physician for both procedures. Mrs. Carter has worked here for 9 years, taking the night shift so she could care for her son during the day. She has never once attempted to contact you or seek any acknowledgement." Charles's face flushed red, a complex mix of emotions playing across his features. Anger still dominated, but now it seemed more defensive, a shield against something deeper and more uncomfortable. "This is preposterous," he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. "I don't owe you anything. You made your choice to remain anonymous. You can't just ambush me like this and expect—" "I don't expect anything, Mr. Whitmore," Ember interrupted gently. "We're only here to pray for your recovery." The simple sincerity of her statement seemed to throw Charles more than any accusation could have. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again, struggling to maintain his angry facade. The corridor remained hushed, the air heavy with unspoken words and shifting perspectives. The medical staff watched the scene with a mixture of awe and sympathy, while the security guards had stepped back, clearly uncertain about their role in this delicate situation. Charles drew himself up, attempting to recover his usual commanding presence. "Well, your prayers aren't needed or wanted, and this changes nothing about the fact that you shouldn't be in this restricted area." But his words rang hollow, lacking their earlier bite. His eyes kept drifting to Arlo, who stood quietly beside his mother, watching everything with those gentle, perceptive eyes. Dr. Ross sighed softly. "Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should—" "No." Charles cut her off sharply. "I don't want to discuss this further. I have appointments waiting, and I won't be manipulated by this situation." He straightened his jacket with trembling hands, his movements betraying his internal turmoil, despite his attempts at composure. The gathered staff began to disperse, sensing the immediate confrontation was over, though the tension remained thick in the air. Charles turned away, his shoulders rigid with suppressed emotion, but he couldn't seem to make himself walk away completely. Ember gently squeezed Arlo's hand, preparing to leave, but Arlo tugged at her arm. She looked down to find him gazing intently at Charles, his expression thoughtful and determined. "Mom," he whispered, pulling slightly at her hand again. "I need to tell him something." Arlo took a small step forward, his gentle eyes fixed on Charles. The movement was subtle but drew everyone's attention. Even Charles, despite his rigid posture, couldn't help but look at the small boy who had given him a second chance at life. "Mummy says you're my daddy, in God's way," Arlo whispered, his voice clear and innocent in the hushed corridor. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Charles's face drained of color, and his carefully maintained facade cracked. His hands, still gripping his jacket lapels, began to tremble more noticeably. The simple truth from a child's lips had accomplished what no amount of medical facts or moral arguments could. It had pierced straight through his defenses. Several nurses quickly turned away, hiding their emotional reactions. Dr. Ross pressed her lips together, her eyes glistening with understanding. But Charles seemed frozen in place, struck by words that challenged everything he'd built his life around. For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his face, a glimpse of the man beneath the power and privilege. But just as quickly his expression hardened again. He took 2 steps backward, his shoes clicking sharply against the polished floor. "I have meetings to attend," he said curtly, his voice slightly hoarse. Without another word, he turned and strode away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Ember drew Arlo close, wrapping her arm around his shoulders. "You did good, baby," she whispered, kissing the top of his head. Sometimes truth needs to be spoken, even when it's hard to hear. Hours later, in his penthouse office overlooking the city, Charles sat behind his massive desk, phone pressed to his ear. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, but he barely noticed the passage of time. His face was set in hard lines as he spoke to his legal team. "I want everything," he ordered, his voice clipped and controlled. "Employment history, financial records, medical documentation. Leave no stone unturned. I need to know exactly who Ember Carter is and what she might really want." He paused, listening to the response on the other end. "Yes, I understand it's sensitive. That's precisely why I need to know what we're dealing with. This woman has had access to this information for years. There must be a reason she's choosing to reveal it now." The irony that Ember hadn't actually chosen to reveal anything seemed lost on him. He ended the call and sat back in his leather chair, running a hand over his face. His other hand rested on a manila folder, his medical records from 8 years ago. Meanwhile, Ember and Arlo made their way home in the early evening light. They walked hand in hand along the familiar streets, their shadows stretching long behind them. The events of the day weighed heavily on Ember's mind, but not in a way that disturbed her peace. "Mom," Arlo said suddenly, looking up at her. "Did I say the wrong thing to Mr. Whitmore?" Ember squeezed his hand gently. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes people need to hear the truth, even if they're not ready for it. You spoke from your heart, and that's never wrong." He looked sad, Arlo observed thoughtfully, under the angry part. Ember smiled softly at her son's perceptiveness. Yes, he did. That's why we'll keep praying for him. At home, their evening routine brought comfort after the emotional day. Ember prepared a simple dinner, helped Arlo with his homework, and then got him ready for bed. As she tucked him in, smoothing his blanket and adjusting his pillow, Arlo's eyes were already heavy with sleep. "Time for prayers," she said softly, kneeling beside his bed. "Dear God," Arlo murmured sleepily, "please help Mr. Whitmore not be so angry, and thank you for making him my daddy in your way." Ember's heart clenched at her son's simple prayer. "Amen," she whispered, kissing his forehead. She remained by his bedside for a few moments, watching as his breathing evened out into sleep. Moving to her own room, Ember knelt beside her bed, clasping her hands together. "Lord," she prayed quietly, "give me strength for whatever comes next. Help me remember that your truth doesn't need defending, it just needs to be lived. And Lord, please soften Charles Whitmore's heart, not for my sake, but for his own." Across the city, in his luxurious penthouse apartment, Charles stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights sparkled below, but his attention was fixed on the medical file open in his hands. The words blurred as he read them for what must have been the 100th time that evening. The file detailed the transplant that saved his life. Clinical, factual, impersonal. But now those sterile medical terms had faces attached to them. A young mother who asked for nothing. A small boy who saw him as family in God's way. Sleep eluded him as he paced his expensive hardwood floors, the file never leaving his hands. His carefully ordered world had been upended by a chance encounter and a child's words, and for the first time in years, control felt like a poor substitute for truth. The morning dawned cool and misty, wrapping the city streets in a gentle haze. Ember Carter stood in her small kitchen, carefully packing Arlo's lunch while he finished his breakfast at their worn but well-loved table. The events of yesterday felt almost dreamlike in the soft morning light, but the slight tremor in her hands as she wrapped Arlo's sandwich betrayed her underlying tension. "Remember to eat your vegetables today, sweetheart," she said, tucking an apple and carrot sticks next to the sandwich. "They'll help you grow strong." Arlo nodded, spooning up the last of his cereal. "Mum, do you think Mr. Whitmore eats his vegetables?" The innocent question made Ember pause. "I'm sure he has people reminding him to take care of himself," she answered carefully, zipping up the lunch bag. Their morning walk to school followed the usual route, but today Ember noticed everything with heightened awareness. The way the crossing guard's eyes lingered on them a moment too long, how the other parents seemed to whisper as they passed. News traveled fast in their community, and she could feel the ripples of yesterday's confrontation spreading. Arlo, however, remained blissfully unaware of the subtle changes. He skipped alongside her, occasionally stopping to examine interesting leaves or point out shapes in the morning clouds. His innocence was a balm to her worried heart. At the school gates, Ember knelt to straighten his jacket collar. "Have a wonderful day, baby. Remember what we always say?" "God's love goes with me," Arlo recited with a smile, hugging her tight before running toward his classroom. The hospital corridors felt different when Ember arrived for her shift. The familiar spaces where she had worked quietly for years now seemed charged with an invisible current. As she changed into her uniform in the staff locker room, she could hear whispered conversations stop abruptly when she entered. Her supervisor, Mrs. Reynolds, appeared at her side as she was gathering her cleaning supplies. The woman's usually friendly face wore an expression of careful neutrality. "Ember," she said, clipboard held close to her chest like a shield. "Could you clarify something for me? Your employment records show you started working here 8 years and 3 months ago. That timing seems significant." Ember met her supervisor's gaze steadily. "Yes, ma'am. I needed work, and the hospital needed help. God provided." Mrs. Reynolds made a note on her clipboard. "And your son's medical history? All his checkups have been at other facilities. Why is that?" "I believed it was best to keep certain things separate." Ember replied quietly, loading cleaning supplies onto her cart. The squeak of its wheels seemed unusually loud in the tense silence. Across the hospital in the executive wing, Charles Whitmore sat on an examination table, his expensive suit jacket draped carefully beside him. Dr. Helen Ross studied the readings on various monitors with a frown creasing her forehead. "Your numbers aren't where I'd like them to be, Charles," she said, making notes in his chart. "The anti-rejection medications should be keeping things more stable than this." Charles waved a dismissive hand. "I have meetings all week. Just adjust the dosage. It's not that simple." Dr. Ross met his eyes firmly. "Your body is showing signs of chronic stress. The transplant tissue is fine." Charles interrupted sharply. "It's been fine for 8 years. Thanks to a perfect match from a healthy young donor," Dr. Ross replied pointedly. "A gift that deserves better care than you're giving it." Charles's jaw tightened, but a slight tremor in his hand betrayed his concern. He quickly clasped his hands together to hide it. Throughout her shift, Ember noticed security guards passing by more frequently than usual. Their gazes followed her as she worked, pretending not to watch while obviously keeping her under surveillance. She kept her head down and continued her tasks, letting her prayers carry her through each moment. During her lunch break, she sat alone in the staff room, feeling the weight of unspoken questions from her co-workers. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Johnson, Arlo's teacher, asking if everything was all right at home. Ember responded with reassurance, though her heart ached at the necessity of such messages. The afternoon brought more subtle interrogations. The head of human resources happened to run into her in a corridor, asking casual questions about her employment history. The hospital's legal consultant was spotted entering administration offices with a thick folder of documents. As evening approached and Ember prepared to end her shift, her supervisor appeared again, this time with an official-looking envelope. "This is for you," Mrs. Reynolds said, her voice carefully professional. "Administration requests your presence tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. It's strongly suggested that you attend." Ember accepted the envelope with steady hands, though her heart beat faster. "Thank you," she said simply. Inside the envelope, formal letterhead detailed the meeting time and location. The words, "regarding your continued employment," stood out starkly, against the white paper. Ember folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. As she changed back into her street clothes, she could hear Charles Whitmore's voice carrying from somewhere down the corridor, sharp with frustration. "I don't care what the tests show. I have an empire to run. Make it work." Ember closed her locker softly, shouldering her bag. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For now, she needed to pick up her son, make dinner, help with homework, and trust in the path that had brought her this far. The evening air was cool on her face as she left the hospital, the weight of the letter in her pocket balanced by the memory of Arlo's morning prayers. "God's love goes with me." She straightened her shoulders and walked toward her son's school, where he would be waiting at aftercare, ready to share stories about his day with his usual enthusiasm. Behind her, the hospital windows gleamed in the setting sun. And somewhere inside, a powerful man confronted his own fragility while a team of investigators pieced together a story she had kept quiet for 8 years. But those concerns would wait until tomorrow. Right now, her son needed his mother, and that was all that mattered. The hospital's administrative conference room felt worlds away from the basement corridors where Ember usually worked. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the polished wood table where she now sat, hands folded quietly in her lap. 3 administrators faced her from the other side: Mr. Peterson from Human Resources, Mrs. Whitfield from Legal, and Dr. Barnes, the hospital director. "Thank you for joining us, Mrs. Carter," Dr. Barnes began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "We appreciate your willingness to discuss some sensitive matters." Ember nodded, her posture straight but not rigid. "I understand." Mrs. Whitfield opened a thick folder. "We've been reviewing your employment history with us. 5 years of consistent service, excellent performance reviews." She paused, studying a document. "But there are some questions about events prior to your employment here." 8 years ago," Mr. Peterson added, "you were employed at 3 different facilities simultaneously while raising a young child alone." "Yes," Ember replied simply. "Arlo was 2 years old then." "That must have been challenging," Dr. Barnes observed, his tone gentler than the others. "It was." Ember's voice remained steady. "But we had what we needed. God provided." Mrs. Whitfield shuffled through more papers. "During that time, you worked as a hospital cleaner at St. Mary's, a cafeteria worker at County General, and a night receptionist at the downtown medical center. All while caring for a toddler," Mr. Peterson noted. "How did you manage?" Ember's hands remained still in her lap. "My church family helped with childcare. I slept when Arlo napped. We had a routine. There were other options," Mrs. Whitfield said carefully. "Financial assistance, programs, support services." "Yes," Ember acknowledged. "But I wanted to stand on my own feet, to show Arlo that dignity doesn't depend on circumstances." The administrators exchanged glances. Dr. Barnes leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Carter, records show that during this period, your son underwent several medical procedures at Children's Hospital. Procedures that would have placed significant financial strain on someone in your position." "The procedures were necessary," Ember said quietly. "The doctors were very kind. We worked out payment plans. And yet," Mrs. Whitfield consulted another document, "you declined multiple offers of charitable assistance, including one rather substantial anonymous donation." Ember's eyes remained steady. "Money with strings attached isn't really a gift. I preferred to work for what we needed." Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "Speaking of work, your employment records show perfect attendance during that entire period. No sick days, no late arrivals, despite working 3 jobs and managing your son's medical needs." "We couldn't afford sick days," Ember explained simply. "And being late shows disrespect for other people's time." The morning light shifted, casting warm patterns on the conference table. Dr. Barnes removed his glasses, cleaning them thoughtfully with his handkerchief. "Mrs. Carter, your work ethic is admirable, but what concerns us is the possibility that you might have withheld certain information during your employment application process." "I answered every question honestly," Ember replied. "Yes," Mrs. Whitfield interjected. "But there's the matter of your son's medical history and its connection to certain current situations." Ember's voice remained gentle but firm. "I never lied. When asked, I kept my promise of privacy. That's not the same as dishonesty." The administrators sat back slightly, considering her words. Mr. Peterson consulted his notes again. "Your financial records show no unusual deposits, no unexplained income. Every dollar is accounted for through documented work." "We live simply," Ember said. What we have, we've earned. Dr. Barnes put his glasses back on, studying her with new respect. Mrs. Carter, your integrity appears to be beyond question, but I hope you understand why recent events have raised concerns. I understand. Ember nodded, and I appreciate your thoroughness. Truth matters. Across the hospital campus, Charles Whitmore paced in his private room, phone pressed to his ear. What do you mean, nothing suspicious? He demanded. Everyone has secrets. Everyone has an angle. His investigator's voice crackled through the speaker. Mr. Whitmore, we've gone through every record available. Mrs. Carter's history is remarkable only in its consistency. Multiple jobs, all documented, regular church attendance, active in community service despite limited time, no debts except medical bills, which she paid faithfully. She even declined anonymous donations that could have eased her burden. Charles ran a hand through his hair in frustration. There has to be something, some scheme, some hidden agenda. Sir, the investigator said carefully, sometimes integrity is simply integrity. After ending the call, Charles stood at his window, staring unseeing at the hospital grounds below. The investigation results lay on his desk, each page confirming what he least wanted to accept, that Ember Carter was exactly who she appeared to be. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. Dr. Ross's warnings about his health echoed in his mind, along with memories of that morning's disappointing test results. The transplant that had given him 8 more years of life, that had built his empire, had come from her child, given freely, without demands or expectations. The thought made him deeply uncomfortable. He was used to transactions, to measuring worth in dollars and influence. This uncomplicated gift challenged everything he believed about how the world worked. Later that afternoon, Charles found himself outside Dr. Ross's office. He hesitated, then knocked. Dr. Ross looked up from her desk, unsurprised. Come in, Charles. The donor file, he said without preamble. The one I refused to read 8 years ago. I want to see it. Dr. Ross regarded him steadily. Are you sure? You were quite adamant then about not wanting to know the details. Things change, Charles replied, his voice rougher than he intended. I need to understand. Dr. Ross nodded slowly and opened her filing cabinet. She withdrew a thick folder, its edges worn with time. Sit down, she said gently, pushing the file across her desk. Charles stared at the folder, suddenly unsure. Inside lay the story of a gift he had taken for granted, proof of a generosity he had never acknowledged. His hand shook slightly as he reached for it. The evening sun cast long shadows across Charles's private hospital suite as he settled into his leather armchair. The donor file lay heavy in his lap, its manila edges worn soft with time. For several minutes he simply stared at it, his fingers tracing the edge without opening it. Finally, with a deep breath, he lifted the cover. The first page was clinical, medical terminology and statistics that meant little to him. But as he turned to the next section, his breath caught. There, in neat handwriting, was a letter he had never wanted to read 8 years ago. Dear recipient, it began. You don't know me, and I've chosen to keep it that way. What matters isn't who we are, but what God has allowed us to share. My son's gift to you comes with no strings, no expectations, and no need for recognition. All I ask is that you live your life knowing someone prayed for your healing before they even knew your name. Charles's hands trembled as he read further. Dear Lord. The prayer continued. Watch over this person who will carry a piece of my son's blessing. Help them find purpose in their second chance. Let them know joy, peace, and the opportunity to bless others as they have been blessed. Amen. The simple words struck him like physical blows. He thought back to 8 years ago, when he'd dismissed the donor information as irrelevant. Success had been his only focus then. Memories flooded back unbidden. The cramped apartment where he'd started his first business, the deals he'd made, the competitors he'd crushed. Each victory had fed his pride, convinced him that he'd earned everything through his own brilliance and determination. He remembered laughing at colleagues who talked about giving back to the community. "Charity is for the weak," he'd often said. "The strong make their own way." The file contained medical updates about Arlo's recovery after the donation, notes about a single mother working multiple jobs to cover the medical bills, refusing financial assistance. Charles saw himself in those same years, expanding his empire, buying his first yacht, complaining about tax rates that cut into his profits. His vision blurred as he read Dr. Ross's notes. Mother demonstrates extraordinary resilience. Despite severe financial hardship, maintains positive outlook and strong moral compass. Primary concern remains child's emotional and spiritual well-being, rather than material comfort. Across town, in a modest apartment kitchen, Ember stirred a pot of homemade soup while Arlo set their small table. The boy carefully arranged 2 bowls, making sure the spoons lined up just right. "Mommy," he said thoughtfully, "can we say an extra prayer tonight?" Ember smiled, adding a pinch of salt to the soup. "Of course, sweetheart. What would you like to pray for?" "For Mr. Whitmore," Arlo said simply. He looked sad today. Ember's hand stilled on the spoon for a moment. "That's very kind of you, Arlo. Yes, we can pray for him. And maybe we can share our soup with him sometime." Arlo continued, adjusting a slightly crooked spoon. "You always say sharing food makes people feel better." Ember's eyes grew soft as she watched her son, his gentle spirit shining through in every small gesture. "That's right, baby. Sharing does make things better." They sat down together, heads bowed for grace. Arlo's small voice rose clear and innocent. "Dear God, thank you for this food and for Mummy's soup. Please help Mr. Whitmore feel better and not be so sad. And thank you for letting us help him, even though he doesn't know us very well yet. Amen." Back in his hospital suite, Charles turned to the final pages of the file. His vision swam as he read the last medical update, dated just 6 months ago. Donor continues to thrive despite economic challenges. Mother maintains strict dietary oversight and positive environmental factors despite limited resources. The papers slipped from his fingers, scattering across the floor. Charles bent to retrieve them, but his hands were shaking too hard. As he reached for one page, a drop of water splashed onto it. Then another. It took him several moments to realize they were his own tears. For the first time since his childhood, since before he'd learned to equate emotion with weakness, Charles Whitmore began to weep. Not the elegant single tear of movies, but deep, racking sobs that bent him double in his chair. He cried for the gift he'd taken for granted, for the years of gratitude he'd never expressed, for the hard-working mother and gentle child who had asked nothing in return for their sacrifice. The sun had set completely now, leaving him in darkness broken only by the city lights outside his window. In that darkness, Charles finally confronted the emptiness of his achievements, the hollowness of his pride. All his wealth, all his power, had come from a second chance he'd never properly acknowledged. A chance given freely by people who had so much less than he did, yet understood so much more about true wealth. His tears continued to fall, years of buried emotion breaking free at last. In the quiet of his hospital room, surrounded by the scattered pages of Ember's love and sacrifice, Charles Whitmore began the long journey toward understanding what it truly meant to be rich. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the executive wing, casting long rectangles of light across the polished floor. Charles Whitmore stood at his suite window, watching the city come alive below. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying memories of pride and missed opportunities. But his eyes were clear now. The morning light seemed different somehow, cleaner, more honest. At 8:15, he picked up his phone and made the call he'd been rehearsing in his mind since dawn. "Ms. Carter, this is Charles Whitmore. I wonder if you and Arlo might meet with me this morning." His voice, usually commanding, held an unfamiliar note of uncertainty. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Ember spoke, her voice was steady but cautious. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore. When would you like to meet?" "Would 10 o'clock be convenient? In the hospital garden pavilion?" He chose the location deliberately, a public space filled with natural light where she would feel safe and respected. "We'll be there," Ember replied simply. Charles spent the next hour and 45 minutes pacing, stopping occasionally to adjust his tie in the mirror. For the first time in years, he questioned his appearance not out of vanity, but from a desire to show proper respect. The hospital garden pavilion was a glass-enclosed space near the healing garden, designed to bring the outdoors inside for patients who couldn't venture out. Potted plants lined the walls, and comfortable seating areas were arranged to catch the morning light. Charles arrived 15 minutes early, asking the staff to provide water and juice. At precisely 10 o'clock, Ember arrived with Arlo. She wore simple clothes, clean, pressed, but clearly well worn. Arlo held her hand, his eyes bright with curiosity as he took in the greenery around them. Several nurses and a few patients watched from nearby, poorly concealing their interest in this unusual meeting. Charles stood as they approached, his usual commanding presence softened by something new, humility. "Ms. Carter, Arlo, thank you for coming. Please, sit wherever you're comfortable." Ember chose a seat that allowed her to see both the door and the garden beyond. Arlo settled beside her, his small hand still in hers. Charles noticed how she positioned herself slightly in front of her son, protective, but not defensive. "Would either of you like something to drink?" Charles gestured to the beverages on a nearby table. "No, thank you," Ember replied quietly. Arlo shook his head, watching Charles with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see straight through to the truth of things. Charles took a deep breath. The carefully prepared speech he'd rehearsed all morning suddenly felt inadequate. Instead, he found himself speaking from his heart for perhaps the first time in decades. "Ms. Carter, Ember, if I may, I owe you and Arlo an apology. Not just for my behavior the other day, which was inexcusable, but for years of ingratitude and blindness to the gift you gave me." He noticed several staff members had drawn closer, no longer pretending not to listen. "Good. Let them hear. Let them witness. My treatment of you was cruel and beneath contempt. I spoke to you with prejudice and contempt when I should have been on my knees thanking you for the sacrifice you and your son made." His voice cracked slightly on the word sacrifice. Ember's expression remained calm, but her eyes held a mix of surprise and careful assessment. Arlo leaned forward slightly, his face showing that same remarkable empathy that had struck Charles before. "I spent last night reading the donor file," Charles continued. "I read about your request for anonymity, your refusal of compensation, your only concern being that the recipient would have a chance at life." He had to pause, gathering himself. "I read your prayer for me, a stranger who had done nothing to deserve such grace." A nurse at the nearby station wiped her eyes quietly. Others had stopped pretending to work entirely, drawn by the raw honesty in Charles's voice. "I want to make things right," he said, leaning forward earnestly. "Not to ease my conscience or buy forgiveness, but because it's what should have been done years ago. I'd like to establish an educational trust for Arlo, whatever schooling he wants, wherever he wants to go, and I want to provide financial support for both of you, in whatever form you're comfortable accepting." Ember's hand tightened slightly on Arlo's, but her voice remained steady. "Mr. Whitmore, we never wanted—" "I know," he interrupted gently. "That's what makes it even more important. Your gift wasn't a transaction. It was pure grace. But please, let me do this. Not as repayment, nothing could repay what you've given me, but as an acknowledgement of the truth." He turned to address the gathering crowd directly. "I want everyone here to know that this woman and her son saved my life, not just through the medical procedure, but through their example of what real strength looks like. I've built an empire on what I thought was strength, but true power lies in the kind of grace they showed, asking nothing in return for giving everything." Arlo spoke up then, his voice clear in the hushed pavilion. "Mommy says that helping others is its own reward." Charles felt something break and heal inside him at those simple words. "Your mummy is very wise, Arlo. I'm just beginning to understand how wise." Turning back to Ember, he continued, "I'd also like to make a public acknowledgement of your gift, with your permission, of course. Not to expose you to publicity you don't want, but to honor the truth and perhaps inspire others to show the same kind of selfless love you've demonstrated." Ember was quiet for a long moment, her face thoughtful. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate your apology, truly. But any decisions about public acknowledgements or financial arrangements will need careful consideration. Arlo's well-being has to be my first priority." Charles nodded quickly. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I've had papers drawn up for the Educational Trust and other support, but there's no pressure to sign anything. Everything moves at your pace, on your terms." "Thank you," she said simply. Arlo spoke again, this time directing his words to Charles. "Are you feeling better now? You looked sad yesterday, but today you look lighter." Charles felt tears prick at his eyes, but for once didn't try to hide them. "Yes, Arlo, I am feeling better. Sometimes telling the truth and saying sorry can make a person's heart feel lighter." "That's what Mummy always says too." Arlo nodded sagely. A small smile touched Ember's lips, the first Charles had seen from her. It transformed her face, showing the beauty that hardship hadn't been able to dim. "I want to make things right," Charles repeated softly. "Not just with words, but with actions. Will you give me that chance?" The morning sun had risen higher now, filling the pavilion with clear, honest light. In that light, 3 people sat together. A powerful man humbled by truth, a strong woman softened by grace, and a child whose wisdom surpassed them both. Around them, hospital staff and patients stood witness to something rare and precious, the moment when pride bowed to love and the past began to heal. Ember looked at her son, then back at Charles. "We can try," she said quietly. "One day at a time." It wasn't a promise of instant forgiveness or immediate trust, but it was something perhaps more valuable, the possibility of growth, of change, of making things right. In the bright morning light of the hospital garden pavilion, that possibility felt like hope itself. The evening shadows lengthened across Charles Whitmore's private hospital suite as he sat reviewing documents on his tablet. Despite the day's emotional breakthrough, old habits died hard, and work provided a familiar comfort. The clock on the wall read 8:45, and the usual night sounds of the hospital filtered through his door, the soft squeak of nurses' shoes, the distant chime of call buttons, the hum of medical equipment. The first twinge came subtly. Charles shifted in his chair, a slight discomfort in his side that he might have dismissed any other day. But tonight, something felt different. Wrong. The pain sharpened, becoming impossible to ignore. His hand trembled as he reached for the call button, and cold sweat beaded on his forehead. "Mr. Whitmore?" The night nurse appeared quickly. "Are you all right?" Charles tried to speak, but nausea swept over him. The room tilted sideways, and his vision blurred. The nurse must have seen something alarming in his face because she immediately pressed the emergency call button. Within minutes, the quiet room erupted into controlled chaos. Dr. Helen Ross arrived, her face tight with concern as she checked his vital signs. "Blood pressure's dropping," she announced. "I need a full panel stat, and get me the transplant team." Charles could only watch as medical personnel swarmed around him, their voices seeming to come from very far away. Fear, raw and primal, clawed at his chest. After all these years of taking his borrowed life for granted, was this how it would end? Just when he'd finally begun to understand its true value? The test results came back quickly, and they weren't good. Dr. Ross's face was grim as she examined them. "There are signs of rejection," she explained, her voice professional but gentle. "We're seeing elevated levels that indicate your body may be attacking the transplanted organ." "But it's been years," Charles managed to say, his voice weak. "Why now?" "Rejection can occur at any time," Dr. Ross replied. "We're starting you on anti-rejection medications immediately, but the next 24 hours will be critical." As nurses hooked up new IV bags and adjusted his monitoring equipment, Charles felt his carefully constructed world crumbling. All his power, all his wealth, meant nothing in the face of this betrayal by his own body. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just hours after finally acknowledging the gift he'd received, his body was trying to reject it. Through the long night, Charles drifted in and out of consciousness. The medications made him groggy, but fear kept him from true sleep. In his more lucid moments, he thought about Ember and Arlo. How many nights had Ember spent in a hospital, watching over her sick child? How had she found the strength to make the decision she did, to give life to a stranger while losing what she loved most? By morning, his condition had stabilized somewhat, but the danger hadn't passed. The medical team monitored him constantly, adjusting medications and checking vital signs. Charles had never felt more vulnerable, more human. When Dr. Ross came to check on him at 7:30 in the morning, she had news. "I've contacted Ember Carter," she said quietly. "Given the circumstances, I felt she should know." Panic flashed through Charles. "Why? I don't want her to see me like this. She's done enough." "She's already here," Dr. Ross interrupted gently. "She came as soon as she heard, after dropping Arlo at school. She's not asking to see you, Charles. She's just here, praying in the chapel." Something broke inside Charles then, the last walls of his pride crumbling away. Here was this woman, whom he had treated so terribly, choosing once again to respond with grace. Not seeking attention or reward, not asking for anything in return. Just quietly offering support in the only way she could. The morning wore on, bringing no improvement. The medical team spoke in hushed voices about treatment options, about possibilities they might need to consider. Charles lay in his bed, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that beeped and hummed, marking out the precious minutes of his life. Fear, different from any he'd known before, wrapped around him like a cold shroud. This wasn't the fear of losing money or power or control. This was the raw terror of facing mortality, of recognizing that all his carefully laid plans and precisely controlled systems meant nothing in the end. He thought about all the years he'd wasted, all the opportunities for kindness he'd dismissed, all the people he'd stepped over in his climb to the top. A nurse came in to check his vitals, her movements efficient but gentle. "Would you like me to ask Ms. Carter to come up?" she offered quietly. Charles shook his head, shame burning beneath his fear. How could he face her now? What right did he have to ask anything more of her? The morning sunlight seemed to mock him, streaming through his window with the same brightness that had witnessed his promises to make things right. Now he might never have the chance. Alone in his room, surrounded by the best medical care money could buy, but feeling utterly helpless, Charles Whitmore faced the possibility that grace, that precious unearned gift, might have come too late. The monitors continued their steady beeping, counting out moments he'd taken for granted for so long. Outside his door, life in the hospital went on, while inside, a man who had always believed in his own power finally understood what it meant to be truly powerless. The fear was a living thing now, pulsing with each beat of his struggling heart. Not just fear of death, but fear of dying before he could prove his change was real, before he could make amends, before he could truly honor the gift he'd been given. As morning turned to afternoon, Charles lay in his isolated room, facing the terrifying possibility that some second chances come too late, and some debts can never be repaid. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the hospital window, painting Charles's room in shades of amber and gold. The medical equipment continued its steady rhythm of beeps and hums, but something had shifted in Charles's demeanor. After hours of internal struggle, he'd finally asked the nurse to send for Ember. When she entered the room, her steps were quiet but sure. She wore her custodial uniform, having come straight from her work in another wing of the hospital. The sight of her, so dignified even in work clothes, made Charles's throat tighten with shame. "Thank you for coming," he managed, his voice rougher than usual. The medications and emotional exhaustion had stripped away his polished exterior. Ember moved to stand near his bed, maintaining a respectful distance. "How are you feeling?" she asked simply. Charles attempted a weak laugh that came out more like a cough. "Terrified," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "I've never been good at being helpless." Ember nodded but didn't speak. Her silence created a space that seemed to demand truth, and Charles found himself filling it. "I need to tell you something," he began, adjusting himself slightly in the bed. The movement caused him to wince. "And I need you to just listen, please. I've spent my whole life talking over people, but right now, I need to say things I should have said yesterday." He paused, gathering his thoughts. The machines kept their steady rhythm, marking time in this moment of vulnerability. "I treated you horribly," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just in that hallway, but in my mind, in my assumptions. I looked at you and saw what I wanted to see, someone beneath me, someone I could dismiss. I've spent my whole life doing that, categorizing people, deciding who matters and who doesn't." Ember remained still, her face composed but attentive. Charles pressed on, feeling as though each word was a weight being lifted. "The truth is, I'm afraid. I've always been afraid. Afraid of being nothing, of being the poor kid I used to be. I built this whole empire, this whole persona, because I couldn't stand feeling insignificant. And when you stood there in that hallway, when you spoke those words about your son..." His voice cracked. "You shattered everything I'd built, because you showed me that the most significant thing in my life, my very life itself, came from people I would have walked past without a second glance." Tears were flowing freely now, but Charles made no move to wipe them away. "I'm ashamed, not just of how I treated you, but of who I've been, of what I've become. All this success, all this power, and I couldn't even manage basic human decency toward the mother of the child who saved my life." The room grew quieter as the sun dipped lower, casting deeper shadows. Charles's confession seemed to hang in the air between them, raw and real. Finally, Ember spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "I forgive you, Mr. Whitmore." The simple statement hit him like a physical force. He hadn't expected it to come so easily, so freely. But Ember wasn't finished. "I forgive you," she repeated. "But forgiveness doesn't mean there isn't work to be done. It doesn't erase the need for change or the impact of your actions. Forgiveness is a beginning, not an end." Charles nodded, understanding the truth in her words. "I want to be better." He whispered, "I don't know how, but I want to try." Ember moved closer to his bed then, her presence both comforting and challenging. "My son didn't save you so you could stay the same," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of truth. The statement hung in the air between them, a challenge and a promise, a reminder that grace demands response. Charles lay there, surrounded by machines that monitored his physical healing, knowing that his deeper healing was only just beginning. The hospital took on a different character at night. The bustling corridors grew quiet, and the overhead lights cast long shadows across the polished floors. In the executive wing, medical staff moved with renewed urgency as Charles Whitmore's condition deteriorated rapidly. Ember held Arlo's hand as they walked towards the chapel, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. She had received the call just as they were finishing dinner. Charles needed emergency surgery, and something in her heart told her they needed to be here. The chapel was small but peaceful, with soft lighting that came from electric candles flickering in wall sconces. Simple wooden pews lined either side of a center aisle, and a plain cross hung on the front wall. Ember chose a pew near the middle, and Arlo settled beside her, his small hand still wrapped in hers. "How long will the surgery take?" Arlo whispered, his voice carrying in the quiet space. "Many hours," Ember answered honestly. "Dr. Ross said it might take until morning." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the play of light on the walls. Outside, the night deepened, and occasional announcements echoed through the hospital corridors, muffled by the chapel's heavy doors. As the clock on the wall ticked past 9 o'clock, Arlo shifted in his seat. "Mommy?" he asked, his voice thoughtful. "Why are we here?" Ember took a deep breath. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it in her heart. But now that it was here, she felt the weight of its importance. "Sweetheart," she began, turning slightly to face him. "Do you remember when we talked about angels and how sometimes God uses people to help other people?" Arlo nodded, his eyes serious in the dim light. "Well, there's something special about you and Mr. Whitmore that I need to tell you about." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "When you were very little, just a tiny baby, you helped save Mr. Whitmore's life." Arlo's forehead wrinkled in concentration. "How did I do that?" "Inside our bodies," Ember explained. "We have special parts that help us live. Sometimes when people are very sick, they need new parts to get better. When you were a baby, you had an extra special part that Mr. Whitmore needed very badly." She watched her son's face carefully as understanding began to dawn. "The doctors asked if we could share that special part with him, and after praying about it, I knew it was the right thing to do." "Did it hurt?" Arlo asked quietly. Ember smiled gently. "No, sweetheart. You were sleeping the whole time, and the doctors took very good care of you." The clock ticked steadily as Arlo processed this information. 10 o'clock came and went. A nurse poked her head in to check on them, offering water and kind smiles. "Is that why you said I'm his daddy in God's way?" Arlo asked after a while, remembering his words from days before. Ember's heart swelled with love for her perceptive child. "Yes, in a way. You gave him something very precious, something that helped him live. But what matters most isn't the gift itself, but how we use the gifts we're given." Arlo nodded slowly, his face thoughtful but peaceful. There was no pride in his expression, no sense of superiority, just the pure acceptance of a child learning about their place in God's bigger picture. As 11 o'clock approached, Ember noticed Arlo's eyes growing heavy. She pulled a small blanket from her bag and made him comfortable across the pew, his head resting in her lap. Her fingers stroked his hair as she hummed softly, old hymns her grandmother had taught her. The night stretched on. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock. Ember prayed silently, her hand resting on Arlo's sleeping form. She prayed for Charles, for the surgical team, for healing that went deeper than physical recovery. At 2:15 in the morning, the chapel door opened quietly. Dr. Helen Ross stepped inside, still wearing her surgical cap. Her face showed exhaustion, but held a hint of relief. "Ember," she said softly, mindful of Arlo's sleep. "The surgery went better than we expected. There were complications, but we managed to stabilize the situation. The next 24 hours will be critical, but we're cautiously optimistic." Ember felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Dr. Ross moved closer, her voice gentle. "You didn't have to stay all night." "Yes," Ember replied, looking down at her sleeping son. "We did." The doctor nodded, understanding passing between them. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. "He's different now, you know. Charles, something's changed in him. I saw it even before the surgery. Whatever happens next, that change is real." Ember nodded, still stroking Arlo's hair. In the quiet of the chapel, as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the windows, she felt peace settle over her heart. Sometimes healing came in unexpected ways, through unexpected people, in God's own time. Sunlight filtered through the blinds of the intensive care unit, casting gentle stripes across Charles Whitmore's face as consciousness slowly returned. His eyelids fluttered, then opened fully, taking in the familiar hospital surroundings. The steady beeping of monitors provided a reassuring rhythm. He was alive. Dr. Helen Ross stood at his bedside, checking his vitals with practiced efficiency. "Welcome back, Mr. Whitmore," she said warmly. "The surgery was successful, though you'll need to take things very easy for a while." Charles tried to speak, his throat dry from the breathing tube that had been removed earlier. A nurse offered him ice chips, which he accepted gratefully. After a few moments, he managed to whisper, "Thank you." The simple words carried more weight than any elaborate speech could have. Dr. Ross noticed the change immediately. Gone was the demanding tone, the expectation of special treatment. In its place was genuine gratitude. As the morning progressed, various hospital administrators hovered nearby, clearly anticipating the need to manage press inquiries and prepare statements. Charles surprised them all by shaking his head weakly. "No press," he said, his voice growing stronger. "No statements, no interviews." The hospital's public relations director stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "But sir, this is an opportunity to highlight the importance of organ donation, to share your story." "It's not my story to share," Charles interrupted quietly but firmly. "The real story belongs to a little boy and his mother who asked for nothing in return." The PR director retreated, clearly confused by this uncharacteristic response from a man known for maximizing every opportunity for publicity. But Charles had other plans forming in his mind. By early afternoon, he felt strong enough to sit up in bed. He asked for his laptop and began making notes, pausing frequently to rest, but driven by a new sense of purpose. When his personal assistant arrived, Charles surprised him with specific requests. "I want you to research everything about anonymous organ donation," he instructed, "and get me information about hospitals in underserved areas, their needs, their challenges, their patient populations." The assistant nodded, though his expression showed confusion at this unexpected direction. "We're going to create a foundation," Charles continued, "but not the usual kind with galas and naming rights. Something different. Something that honors the spirit of anonymous giving." As he worked, Charles reflected on how foreign these ideas would have seemed to him just days ago. His previous charitable endeavors had always been calculated for maximum visibility and tax advantages. Now, he found himself drawn to the idea of quiet impact, of helping without fanfare. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a soft knock at the door interrupted his planning. Ember stood in the doorway with Arlo, both still in their regular clothes, she in her custodial uniform, he in his school clothes. "We wanted to check on you before my shift starts," Ember said simply. Charles set aside his laptop, suddenly aware of how much these brief visits meant to him. "Please come in." Arlo approached the bed without fear, his eyes taking in the medical equipment with quiet curiosity. "Are you feeling better?" he asked. "Much better," Charles replied, his voice softening. "Thanks to some very good doctors, and thanks to you from a long time ago." Ember remained standing near the door, present, but allowing space for the moment. Her posture was relaxed, neither seeking approval nor showing resentment. She had found her peace with this situation long ago. "I've been thinking," Charles said, addressing both of them, "about how to honor what you did, what you both did. Not with money or recognition, since I know that's not what you want, but by helping others do the same thing." He explained his idea for the foundation, watching their reactions carefully. It would support anonymous donors and their families, help underfunded hospitals get the equipment they need for transplant programs, maybe even provide transportation for patients who have to travel far for treatment. Ember listened thoughtfully, then nodded. "That sounds like a wonderful way to help others. Would you—" Charles hesitated, then continued. "Would you be willing to advise us? Not publicly, but behind the scenes. Your perspective would be valuable." "I'll think about it," Ember replied honestly. "Right now, I need to get to my shift. Come on, Arlo." Arlo gave a small wave goodbye, which Charles returned. He watched as they walked down the corridor together, Ember's hand resting gently on her son's shoulder. Their steps were unhurried, dignified, people who knew exactly who they were and what mattered to them. In that moment, Charles understood something profound about the nature of giving. True gratitude wasn't about repayment or grand gestures. It was about recognizing the gift for what it was, an act of pure grace, and letting that recognition change you from the inside out. The evening sun cast long shadows across his hospital room as Charles returned to his planning, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He had been given not just life, but a chance to live it differently. And this time, he wouldn't waste it. The autumn leaves drifted past the hospital windows as Charles marked his 3rd week of recovery. Physical therapy had become his new routine, learning to balance strength with patience, just as he was learning to balance his old drive with new wisdom. "Small steps today, Mr. Whitmore," his therapist encouraged, watching him complete another lap around the rehabilitation floor. "Just Charles," he corrected gently, a response that still surprised the hospital staff, who remembered his previous insistence on formal titles. By the 4th week, Charles called a meeting of his corporate board. The spacious boardroom felt different from his hospital bed, where he sat propped up, with pillows, but spoke with quiet authority through a video call. "Effective immediately, I'm stepping down as CEO," he announced. The screen filled with shocked faces and immediate protests. "This isn't a discussion. I've already chosen my successor, someone who will maintain our profitability while expanding our community involvement." In his 5th week of recovery, autumn deepening into early winter, Charles began the paperwork for his foundation. He worked closely with legal teams to ensure its structure would support anonymous giving and protect donor privacy. The Foundation's mission statement emphasized dignity over recognition, service over status. During this time, Ember continued her nightly rounds, pushing her cart through familiar corridors. But now there was a textbook in her break room locker, and study notes filled her phone. The nursing program application had arrived mysteriously one morning, along with notification of a full scholarship from an anonymous donor. "Mom, look!" Arlo exclaimed one Saturday morning in their small kitchen, pointing to the acceptance letter that had just arrived. "You got in." Ember held the letter with trembling hands, joy mixing with determination on her face. "We got in, baby. This is our journey together." As winter settled in, Arlo began spending his Saturday mornings at the hospital. Not as a patient or visitor, but as the youngest volunteer in the pediatric ward. His gentle presence brought comfort to nervous children waiting for procedures or recovering from treatments. "Why aren't you scared of hospitals?" a young patient asked him one day. Arlo thought carefully before answering. "Because hospitals are where people help each other. Sometimes it's scary, but it's always important." Charles watched this transformation from a distance, receiving weekly updates from Dr. Ross about both Ember's progress in nursing school and Arlo's volunteer work. He never interfered directly, but ensured through quiet channels that they had whatever support they needed. By midwinter, Charles had fully recovered and moved his office from the corporate tower to a modest building near the hospital. His new work focused entirely on the Foundation, which he named simply the Anonymous Gift. Its first project was upgrading transplant facilities in 3 underserved hospitals. One particularly cold morning, Ember arrived for her nursing classes to find new simulation equipment in the training lab. The anonymous donation card simply read, "For those who give of themselves." The seasons continued their gentle turn. Spring brought new energy to the hospital gardens, where Arlo now helped tend the flowers between his volunteer shifts. Ember balanced her studies with work, her quiet determination inspiring her classmates who never knew her full story. Charles adapted to his new rhythm of life. Board meetings were replaced by foundation planning sessions. Instead of quarterly profit reports, he reviewed grant applications from small hospitals. His former business associates expressed confusion at his choices, but he found peace in this simpler path. On a warm day in late spring, the hospital hosted its annual donor recognition ceremony. The auditorium filled with recipients, donor families, and medical staff. Charles slipped in quietly through a side door, choosing to stand at the back of the room. From his position, he could see Ember and Arlo seated near the middle, there to represent the hospital's volunteer program. Neither of them knew he was present, and he preferred it that way. As stories of generosity and gratitude filled the room, Charles observed the gentle way Arlo held his mother's hand, the quiet pride in Ember's posture as she sat in her student nurse's uniform. A young speaker took the stage, sharing her story of receiving a life-saving donation. "The greatest gift," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, "isn't just the years added to our lives, but how we choose to live them." Charles felt tears well up in his eyes, but this time he didn't fight them. In the back of that crowded auditorium, anonymous among the standing observers, he finally understood the full meaning of grace. It wasn't just about receiving, it was about becoming someone worthy of the gift. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for donors past and present. In that sacred quiet, Charles watched as Arlo leaned his head against his mother's shoulder, their silhouettes peaceful and strong. They were his teachers, though they might never know the full extent of their lesson. Through them, he had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or titles, but in the quiet courage to give without recognition, to love without condition, to serve without reward. As the audience rose for the final blessing, Charles remained in his place at the back, one more anonymous heart in a room full of stories of grace. The morning sunlight streamed through the wide hospital windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors of St. Margaret's Hospital. 5 years had transformed not just the building, but the people within it. Where there had once been stark white walls, now vibrant murals brought warmth to every corridor. Children's artwork decorated the pediatric wing, and the once sterile atmosphere had given way to something more hopeful. 15-year-old Arlo Carter moved through these halls with quiet confidence. His lanky teenage frame had grown tall, though he still carried himself with that same gentle grace that had marked his childhood. The navy blue volunteer vest he wore bore a silver pin marking his 500 hours of service, but it was his warm smile that truly identified him to the regular patients and staff. "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson," he called out softly to an elderly patient making her way down the hall with a walker. "Would you like some company?" The woman's face brightened at the sight of him. "Arlo, dear, yes, please." "Yes, these morning walks are much nicer with a friend." From the nurse's station, Ember watched her son assist Mrs. Peterson, matching his pace perfectly to the elderly woman's careful steps. Pride swelled in her heart, though she kept it contained behind her professional demeanor. Her own transformation was evident in the crisp white uniform she wore, the RN badge that caught the morning light, and the quiet authority she had earned through years of dedicated study and service. "He's got your heart," Nancy, a veteran nurse, remarked beside her. "Natural healer, that one." Ember nodded, remembering the long journey that had brought them here. "God had a plan," she said softly. "We just had to trust it." Further down the corridor, partially hidden by a corner, Charles Whitmore stood observing the scene. Time had softened his once sharp edges, silver threading through his hair at the temples. His expensive suits had given way to more modest attire, though he still carried himself with dignity. The arrogance that had once defined him had been replaced by something gentler, more contemplative. He watched as Arlo finished walking with Mrs. Peterson, ensuring she was safely seated in the sunroom before moving on to his next task. The boy, now young man, had no idea he was being observed, and Charles preferred it that way. These quiet moments of witness were his private redemption. Arlo moved through his morning routine with practiced ease. He delivered magazines to waiting rooms, helped a young patient navigate his new wheelchair, and spent time reading to children in the pediatric ward. Each interaction carried the same attention and care, whether he was helping a doctor with supplies or comforting a nervous family member. Near noon, as sunlight filled the hospital atrium, Arlo passed close to where Charles stood. For a brief moment, their eyes met. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The years had built an understanding between them, unspoken but profound. Arlo gave a small, respectful nod, which Charles returned, emotion flickering briefly across his weathered features. Ember, making her rounds, caught this silent exchange. She paused in her work, allowing herself to absorb the weight of the moment. So much had changed since that first confrontation in these same halls. The anger and fear had long since dissolved, replaced by a peace that none of them could have imagined in those early days. Charles shifted his gaze to meet Ember's. In that look passed years of understanding, forgiveness, and grace. She offered him a gentle smile, the kind that acknowledged their shared history without being bound by it. He nodded in return, his eyes conveying a gratitude that had only deepened with time. The hospital moved around them in its eternal rhythm of life, death, and healing. Doctors hurried past with charts, nurses discussed treatment plans, and somewhere a baby's first cry echoed down the corridor. In the midst of it all, these three souls stood, connected by a choice made years ago, a gift given in faith, received in desperation, and transformed by grace into something beautiful. Arlo continued his rounds, unaware of the profound moment unfolding behind him. To him, this was simply another morning of service, another opportunity to extend kindness to those in need. He carried within him the best of both his mother's compassion and Charles's determination, though shaped by his own gentle spirit. The morning light shifted, casting new patterns across the hospital floors. Charles quietly withdrew, returning to his foundation work in the modest office he now preferred. Ember resumed her nursing duties, her steps sure and purposeful. And Arlo moved on to his next task, embodying the quiet continuity of lives forever changed by an act of grace. In the steady rhythm of the hospital's life, their story continued, not ended, but transformed. Each in their own way carried forward the lesson they had learned, that the greatest healing comes not from medicine alone, but from the courage to give, the humility to receive, and the wisdom to recognize grace in all its forms. The sun climbed higher in the sky, another day of service unfolding beneath its warmth. In the halls of St. Margaret's, where their story had begun, 3 lives touched by grace continued their journey, changed, healed, and bound together by the enduring power of an anonymous gift. The afternoon sun streamed through the hospital windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors where everything had begun. Ember Carter stood at the nurses' station, her crisp uniform a testament to the years of dedication that had transformed her from custodian to registered nurse. She watched the familiar flow of hospital life with knowing eyes, remembering countless nights of mopping these same floors, praying silently as she worked. Today the corridor buzzed with its usual activity, but Ember's thoughts drifted to deeper waters. She thought about silence. Not the empty kind, but the full silence of prayers whispered in dark hours, of truth held close until its proper time. She had learned that some of life's most powerful moments came wrapped in quiet, like the gentle determination that had carried her through years of night shifts and nursing school. A soft whimper caught her attention. Down the hall, an elderly woman clutched her walker, fear evident in her hesitant steps. Before Ember could move, Arlo was already there, his tall teenage frame bending slightly to meet the woman's eyes. "Mrs. Harrison," he said warmly, "would you like some company for your walk?" The woman's anxious expression softened at his gentle tone. "Oh, Arlo, dear, these halls seem longer every day." "Then we'll take them one step at a time," he replied, adjusting his volunteer badge. "Did I ever tell you about the time I tried to teach my friend's cat to walk on a leash?" Mrs. Harrison's nervous chuckle echoed in the corridor as Arlo began his story, his voice carrying just the right mix of humor and encouragement. Ember watched as her son matched his pace to the elderly woman's careful steps, his story drawing out more smiles with each passing moment. From her vantage point, Ember could see the subtle ways Arlo supported Mrs. Harrison, a steadying hand when needed, a pause timed perfectly with her breathing, the natural way he positioned himself to prevent falls. These weren't skills taught in volunteer training. They came from something deeper, an innate understanding of human vulnerability and strength. Near the window at the corridor's end, Charles Whitmore observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. His once imposing presence had mellowed into something more genuine. The designer suits were gone, replaced by a simple blazer and slacks. He held a worn leather briefcase containing papers for the Donor Foundation, his life's new work, though few knew of his involvement. Ember caught his eye across the distance, and in that moment she felt the weight of their shared history. The anger that had once filled these halls had long since dissolved into something more profound, a recognition of Grace's persistent work in stubborn hearts. She remembered her prayers from those early days, not for justice or revenge, but for transformation. Charles nodded slightly, acknowledging their silent exchange. Then, without fanfare or attention, he turned and walked toward the exit. His steps were unhurried, at peace with his choice to remain in the background of the Foundation's work. The automatic doors opened and closed, and he was gone. Not fleeing this time, but simply moving forward in his chosen path of quiet service. Arlo finished his walk with Mrs. Harrison, ensuring she was comfortably seated before stepping back. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, and her enthusiastic nod brought another smile to his face. As the day shifted toward evening, Ember found herself in the hospital chapel. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass, painting the small space with warm colors. She sat in the familiar pew, where she had spent countless hours over the years. Her prayer came naturally, rising from a heart that had learned the true measure of wealth. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "not for recognition or reward, but for the gift of redemption. Thank you for hearts that can change, for grace that transforms, and for the privilege of witnessing your work in silent moments." She paused, watching dust motes dance in the colored light. Her thoughts turned to the long journey, from that first desperate decision to donate, through years of quiet service, to this moment of peaceful reflection. The path had never led to wealth or fame, but it had brought something far more precious. The sight of hearts made new, of pride transformed to purpose, of wounds becoming wells of compassion. "Thank you," she continued, "for redemption freely given and freely received." Her words filled the chapel's silence, carrying with them the weight of years, the warmth of gratitude, and the quiet joy of seeing grace complete its perfect work. The sun's last rays painted the chapel in gentle gold, a final blessing on a story that had begun in darkness but found its way, step by step, into light. In the hallway outside, life continued its eternal dance of healing and hope, while within the chapel, Ember's prayer of thanksgiving rose like incense, a fitting close to a journey that had always been about something larger than herself. Through the chapel window, she could see Arlo starting his final rounds of the day, moving with the same quiet purpose that had marked his life from the beginning. In his gentle interaction with patients, in Charles's transformed life of service, in her own journey from custodian to nurse, she saw the endless ripples of grace, freely given, freely received, and freely passed on to others in need of healing. Sunlight painted long shadows across the city sidewalks as Ember and Arlo walked away from the hospital on that peaceful Sunday morning. The familiar streets felt different somehow, not because they had changed, but because she had. The weight of secrecy and struggle that had once bent her shoulders was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from living in the light of truth. And then Sarah, from my science class, she asked if she could volunteer with me next weekend. Arlo was saying, his face animated as he described his school life. I told her about Mrs. Peterson and how she loves hearing stories about animals, so Sarah's going to bring pictures of her new puppy. Ember smiled, watching her son's hands move expressively as he talked. His kindness had become as natural as breathing, flowing out to others without thought of recognition or reward. The miracle wasn't in grand gestures anymore, but in the steady stream of small kindnesses that marked his days. The morning air carried the scent of fresh bread from the corner bakery, mixing with the lingering traces of spring flowers in the small park they passed. Ember adjusted her nursing textbook under her arm, its weight a reminder of new paths opening before her. Her classes were challenging but deeply satisfying, filling her mind with knowledge while her heart remained anchored in service. At the crosswalk, they paused for the light to change. Arlo pointed out a nest of birds in a nearby tree, his gentle observation skills as sharp as ever. Ember closed her eyes briefly, letting gratitude wash over her like the warm sunlight on her face. "Thank you, Lord," she prayed silently, her heart full. Not for the dramatic moments that had changed their lives, though those too were part of their story. No, her thanks was for the quiet transformation that had followed. Peaceful evenings spent studying while Arlo did his homework, the growing confidence in her voice as she answered questions in class, the way sleep came easily now, untroubled by worry or want. The light changed, and they stepped forward together. Arlo continued sharing his plans for the upcoming week. A science project, his regular volunteer shifts, a book he wanted to read to the children in the pediatric ward. His voice carried the easy enthusiasm of someone who had found his place in the world, who understood that purpose often came wrapped in ordinary moments. Walking beside him, Ember felt the simple truth settle over them like a blessing. While their story had pivoted on one dramatic moment in a hospital corridor, the real healing, the deep, lasting kind, had come in these quiet days that followed. In homework completed, in kind words spoken, in faithful steps taken day after day. Grace wasn't just a moment of forgiveness. It was the patient work of living that forgiveness forward, one ordinary choice at a time. The morning stretched before them, bright with possibility, as mother and son walked on through their transformed world, not running from or toward anything now, but simply walking forward together in the light of grace lived out. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.